11 shameful habits people have after 60 candid confessions no one dares talk about. Have you ever sat quietly in a room full of people and felt completely alone? It's a strange kind of emptiness, one that doesn't come from the absence of others, but from a slow, silent fading of connection. As we age, this kind of loneliness creeps in not with a loud crash, but with quiet footsteps. One day, you notice the phone doesn't ring as often. Invitations stop coming. Conversations become shorter, colder. For Laura, it didn't happen all at once. In fact, she couldn't tell you exactly when it began. But she felt it, the slow unraveling of the closeness she once shared with her children, her friends, even neighbors who used to wave when they passed by. And here's the truth many won't say out loud: the root of this loneliness often isn't illness, or wrinkles, or bad luck. It's habits, small, invisible ones, that we pick up over time. Habits that close our hearts without us realizing. Habits that gently, quietly, push people away. But here's the good news: just as these habits are learned, they can also be unlearned. And if caught in time, they can be reversed. Laura's story isn't just a warning, it's a gentle wake-up call. Because while she almost lost everyone she loved, she also discovered that change is always possible. Even in your 70s. Even in your 80s. Even when you think it's too late. Her journey begins with a single realization: she had stopped enjoying life. Before we get started, I'd love it if you'd give this video a like. It helps me keep sharing important lessons. If you're not already subscribed, I encourage you to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on new videos. Also, if you like this video, write a 1 in the comments and a 0 if you don't, so I know what can be improved. So, here we go. 1. Loss of the ability to enjoy life. In her younger years, Laura had been the kind of woman who could find joy in the simplest things: a warm cup of tea by the window, the scent of freshly baked bread, the sound of birds in the early morning. But somewhere along the way, those small delights stopped reaching her heart. She didn't notice it at first. After all, life had become busy with doctor appointments, bills, and aches that didn't go away. Days blurred together. "I'm just tired," she would say. It's normal at this age. But this wasn't just tiredness. This was emotional drought. She stopped lighting her favorite candle in the evenings. She no longer reached for her paints, once her greatest joy. Even music, those old records that used to make her sing while cleaning the kitchen, felt like noise. What she didn't realize was that this quiet disconnection was making her bitter, not just bored. The joylessness seeped into her voice, her expressions, even her posture. People began to feel it. Her daughter stopped calling as often. Her friends visited less. And Laura, unaware of the subtle shift, only grew more convinced that everyone else had changed. But the truth? It wasn't them, it was the light inside her that had dimmed. Joy is magnetic. Even the tiniest spark of it invites people in. And when we lose the ability to find wonder in life's little moments, we stop giving others a reason to come close. For Laura, it wasn't until her young neighbor asked, "Why don't you sit outside anymore?" that she realized just how far she drifted from herself. It was a small question. But it opened a door. 2. Ignoring personal hygiene and appearance. Laura had always taken pride in her appearance. She wasn't flashy, never cared for expensive clothes or bold lipstick, but she did have a quiet elegance. A clean blouse, a touch of perfume, brushed hair pulled into a neat bun. It wasn't about vanity. It was about dignity. But slowly, that part of her faded. At first, it was little things. She stopped ironing her clothes. Her hair stayed unbrushed for days. A once-loved shade of rose lipstick remained untouched in a dusty drawer. "Why bother?" she muttered to herself. "There's no one to impress." The trouble was, this wasn't just about looks. Neglecting her appearance began to affect how she saw herself. She started feeling invisible. Her self-worth crumbled. And others noticed, even if they didn't say it out loud. Her grandchildren, once eager to cuddle up beside her, now seemed hesitant. Her neighbor, who used to drop by often, stayed longer at the gate, no longer inviting herself in. And Laura, misreading their distance, thought they were being unkind. But the truth was simpler and sadder. People respond not only to how you look, but to how you carry yourself. When you stop showing care for yourself, others unconsciously follow suit. She had unknowingly sent a message, "I don't matter anymore." It wasn't until she caught a glimpse of herself in a store window, slouched, hair messy, blouse stained, that something inside her stirred. She didn't recognize the woman staring back. And just like that, Laura decided to make one small change. She brushed her hair that night. Not for anyone else, but for herself. 3. Refusal to accept help. There was a time when Laura could carry all her groceries in one trip, climb a ladder to change a bulb, and shovel snow from her porch before breakfast. She was proud of her independence. It had been her shield, her identity, her proof that she was still strong. So when people began offering help, her daughter suggesting a housekeeper, her neighbor offering to mow the lawn, Laura refused, sharply. "I'm not helpless," she would snap. "I can manage." But managing came at a price. She strained her back lifting a box. She slipped once while reaching for something high. Her refrigerator stayed half empty because walking to the store had become too tiring. Yet the hardest part wasn't the physical strain. It was the emotional distance her pride created. Every time she rejected an offer with a curt "No, I'm fine," she unknowingly pushed people away. Eventually, they stopped asking. And soon, they stopped showing up. In truth, accepting help isn't weakness. It's connection. It's allowing others to love you in practical ways. But Laura had confused independence with isolation. Her pride had become a prison. It wasn't until she overheard her daughter whisper, "She doesn't need us anymore," that she felt the sting, not in her body, but in her heart. Because that wasn't what she meant at all. 4. Hoarding and refusal to let go of old things. Laura's house had once been warm and inviting, a place where the smell of cinnamon tea floated through the air and framed family photos lined the hallway. But over the years, the house began to change. It grew heavier. Not with people, but with things. Stacks of old newspapers cluttered corners. Drawers overflowed with expired coupons, broken watches, and keys to locks that no longer existed. Boxes filled with clothes she hadn't worn in decades lined the spare room, untouched and gathering dust. Each item had a story, a memory. Letting go felt like erasing a piece of herself. But what Laura didn't realize was that her clinging to the past was slowly pushing away the present. When her granddaughter visited and asked to sleep over, there was no space. "Too many things in the guest room," Laura admitted with a strained smile. When her friend stopped by for tea, they sat squeezed between stacked books and forgotten furniture. The clutter wasn't just physical, it became emotional noise. It whispered constantly of loss, of what once was. And in that crowded space, joy had no room to breathe. One day, Laura tripped over a box of old magazines. As she sat on the floor, dazed and frustrated, she looked around at the life she had packed into piles and realized her home no longer felt like a home. That was the day she made a choice, to keep the memories, but release the mess. Not all at once, but one item at a time. Not to forget the past, but to make space for the future. 5. Excessive frugality and refusal of pleasures. Laura had always been careful with money. Growing up during hard times had taught her to stretch every dollar, reuse every container, and save for just in case. But what started as wisdom became something else entirely, a fear of spending that slowly drained her life of color. Even after her mortgage was paid off and her pension came in regularly, she still denied herself the smallest pleasures. She reused tea bags until there was no flavor left. She patched the same cardigan until it barely held together. When her friends invited her to lunch, she declined with a polite excuse, worried about wasting money on something unnecessary. But behind that caution was a deeper habit, the inability to believe she was allowed to enjoy life. Her home felt bare, not from lack of money, but from a refusal to spend any. She stopped buying flowers, even though they once brought her joy. She avoided turning on the heater in winter, bundling up instead, teeth chattering. The irony? She wasn't saving for anything. Her nest egg sat untouched, while her life grew colder, quieter. One day, her neighbor brought over a fresh pie. Laura's eyes lit up at the smell, but she hesitated to eat it. "It's too nice," she said. "I'll save it." That pie sat in the fridge until it spoiled. And with it, something inside her wilted. Laura finally asked herself, what am I saving all this for, if not for living? That question cracked something open, and for the first time in years, she bought herself a new pair of slippers. Soft. Warm. Comfortable. Not because she needed them, but because she deserved them. 6. Impatience towards others. Laura used to be known for her gentleness. Neighbors would say she had the calm presence of someone who'd seen it all and didn't rush through anything. But over time, something in her changed. Maybe it was the daily aches, the fatigue, or simply the loneliness building inside. Whatever the reason, Laura's patience began to run thin. She snapped at the cashier for being too slow. She sighed loudly when her friend forgot a story they'd already shared. When her grandson spilled juice on the carpet, she scolded him sharply, not noticing how his smile disappeared. These weren't explosive outbursts, but small, sharp pricks. Words that stung, tones that discouraged, silences that built walls. Laura didn't mean to be unkind. She was just tired. But others couldn't see that. All they felt was the tension. Little by little, her phone rang less. Visits became shorter. People didn't want to walk on eggshells. And once again, Laura found herself more alone, believing others had changed, not realizing how much she had. It all came to light one evening when her neighbor's daughter, a bright, chatty little girl, visited. Laura, irritated by the noise, told her sharply to hush. The girl paused, then whispered to her mother, "She's not nice anymore." Those 5 words stayed with Laura all night. The next morning, she left a note and a plate of cookies at their door. And for the first time in a long while, she sat with her own feelings, not to justify them, but to understand them. Patience, she realized, wasn't just a virtue. It was a bridge, one she'd started burning without noticing. 7. Holding grudges and resentment. There were names Laura hadn't spoken in years. A cousin who never returned her calls. A neighbor who once borrowed her garden hose and never gave it back. A friend who didn't show up at her husband's funeral. The list wasn't long, but it was heavy. Whenever their names came up, Laura's voice tightened. "I haven't forgotten what they did," she'd say, with a finality that closed every door. In her mind, she was just protecting herself, keeping the pain at a safe distance. But holding on to resentment is like clutching a hot coal. You burn yourself long before anyone else feels the heat. And that's exactly what happened to Laura. She replayed old wounds like a broken record, revisiting betrayals and slights, large and small. Her face would harden. Her stories, once filled with warmth, became bitter recountings of who let her down and when. What she didn't see was how that bitterness shaped her presence. It made conversations feel colder, less inviting. Even her laughter, when it came, carried a slight edge. One afternoon, her granddaughter innocently asked, "Grandma, why don't you talk to Aunt May anymore?" Laura opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came. The truth was, she didn't even remember the original argument, only the feeling that she had been wronged. That silence was a revelation. How much love had she missed out on? How many joyful reunions had she denied herself, just to hold on to being right? Laura sat with that question. And that evening, for the first time in over a decade, she wrote a letter. Not to reopen wounds, but to release them. Because forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It was about reclaiming her peace. 8. Stubbornness and resistance to change. Laura had never been what you'd call tech-savvy. She liked things the way they were, paper books, handwritten letters, her old landline phone with the curly cord. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, she'd often say, half laughing. But in a world that was changing faster than ever, that resistance slowly turned into isolation. Her children had switched to texting. Her church group moved their meetings to video calls. Her doctor's office sent reminders through an app she didn't know how to use. At first, she didn't mind missing a few things. But over time, she began missing more than appointments, she missed connections. Photos of her great-granddaughter's first steps were sent in a group chat she wasn't part of. Her grandson's piano recital was streamed online while she sat in her kitchen, unaware it was even happening. She wasn't being excluded on purpose, she was excluding herself by standing still in a world that was moving forward. When her daughter tried to show her how to use a tablet, Laura waved her off. "Too complicated," she said. "I'm too old to learn." But one evening, after another quiet day with no calls and no visits, she sat alone at the kitchen table and asked herself, what if I'm not too old, just too afraid? The next morning, she asked her granddaughter for help. They sat together, laughing through the awkward first clicks and swipes. Laura fumbled, got frustrated, but kept going. That small choice didn't just open a screen, it opened doors. Messages began arriving. Photos. Invitations. A feeling of being part of things again. Because the truth is, change doesn't ask us to abandon who we are. It just asks us to stay open, to learning, to growing, to staying connected. Even in our 70s. Even beyond. 9. Criticism of younger generations. Laura often found herself shaking her head at the world her grandchildren were growing up in. "They're always on those phones," she'd mutter. "No one knows how to have a real conversation anymore." She criticized their clothes, their music, their slang, even the way they cooked, who puts avocado on toast. To her, it felt like harmless observation. But to those around her, especially the younger ones, it felt like rejection. During family gatherings, conversations with her teenage grandson would quickly fizzle out. When her granddaughter excitedly talked about a new video she made, Laura would sigh, "Back in my day, we did real work, not this online nonsense." She didn't mean to be cruel, she just couldn't understand their world. And rather than ask, she judged. Over time, they stopped sharing. Stopped opening up. Stopped coming close. What Laura didn't realize was that every critique was a tiny door closing. Each comment, though small, said, "I don't accept who you are." But connection doesn't grow from comparison, it grows from curiosity. One afternoon, her grandson asked, "Grandma, do you want to see the app one built?" She nearly said no. But something stopped her. Instead, she smiled and said, "Show me." For the next hour, she listened, really listened, as he explained a world she'd never understood. And for the first time in a long while, she saw that world not as strange, but as brilliant. That small moment sparked something bigger, a new way to relate, not through judgment, but through wonder. Because when we choose curiosity over criticism, we stop pushing people away and start inviting them in. 10. Ignoring health issues. Laura had always prided herself on being tough. "I've lived through worse," she'd say whenever her knees ached or when her chest tightened after walking up the stairs. She waved off her daughter's concerns, brushed aside doctor reminders, and told herself, it's just part of getting old. But beneath that bravado was fear, a quiet, gnawing fear of what a diagnosis might mean, of being seen as fragile, of losing control. So she ignored the signs. She skipped appointments. She let prescriptions lapse. She dismissed dizziness as just needing a glass of water. And each time she did, her body whispered a little louder, until one morning, it roared. Laura collapsed while watering her garden. The fall wasn't life-threatening, but it was a wake-up call. As she lay in the hospital bed, bruised and exhausted, she couldn't help but wonder, what if I had listened earlier? The hardest part wasn't the injury, it was realizing how her silence had worried her loved ones. Her daughter's tears. Her grandson's pale, anxious face. By ignoring her health, Laura hadn't just endangered herself, she had unintentionally distanced those who cared most. They didn't know how to help because she never let them see the truth. When she returned home, Laura did something different. She scheduled her checkups. She spoke openly about her pain. She allowed her family to support her, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. Because facing our vulnerabilities doesn't make us weaker. It makes us stronger, together. 11. Excessive talking and inability to listen. Laura had so much to say, stories from her youth, advice wrapped in old sayings, warnings disguised as wisdom. And at first, people listened politely. After all, she had lived a full life. She had seen things, survived things. But over time, her conversations began to feel more like monologues. She interrupted without meaning to. She jumped in with her own memories before others could finish theirs. She answered questions no one had asked. And slowly, people stopped confiding in her. At first, she didn't notice. She thought her grandson had just gotten quiet. That her neighbor was too busy. That her daughter didn't need to talk like they used to. But the truth was harder. They were pulling away, not because she talked too much, but because she listened too little. Conversation is a bridge, not a stage. And Laura, unknowingly, had taken up all the space on it. It wasn't until a friend gently said, "Sometimes I just need you to hear me," that Laura paused. She realized how many moments she had missed, how many emotions she had overlooked, because she was too eager to fill the silence. That week, Laura made a quiet commitment to speak less and listen more. She asked questions without adding her own story. She let the pauses linger, even when they felt awkward. She listened, not just with her ears, but with her heart. And in that stillness, something beautiful happened. People began opening up again. Conversations became softer, deeper. And Laura rediscovered something she had forgotten, the gift of truly being present. Conclusion: the quiet return to connection. Laura didn't change overnight. There was no dramatic moment, no sweeping transformation. Just quiet shifts, one thoughtful choice at a time. A kind word instead of a complaint. A listening ear instead of another opinion. A warm greeting instead of silence. With each habit she let go of, something returned to her. Her daughter began calling more often, not out of obligation, but with laughter in her voice. Her grandchildren stopped by, not just to help, but to sit, to talk, to share. Neighbors waved again. Invitations returned. Laura hadn't reversed time, but she had restored something more precious, the closeness she thought was gone forever. She had learned that loneliness doesn't always come from being alone, it often comes from the invisible walls we build around ourselves. Walls made of pride, fear, judgment, and pain. But the beautiful truth? Those walls can be taken down. And the moment you begin to dismantle them, even gently, life finds its way back in, through laughter, forgiveness, conversation, and shared silence. Laura's story reminds us that joy in old age isn't found in what we have, but in how we choose to live, with openness, humility, and heart. Because no matter how long it's been, it's never too late to reconnect, to rediscover, and to be surrounded once again by the warmth of love.